Cranesbills belong to the geranium family, which has many species that have large, brightly coloured flowers, which makes great garden favourites of them. But to my mind, the loveliest of the cranesbill geraniums, and largely unappreciated as such only because the flowers are relatively small and easy to overlook, is the cranesbill known as Herb Robert, which is growing here prolifically in one of its favourite habitats, which is the base of hedge banks. And maybe the best way to describe the flowers, the texture of the flowers, it's like rose-coloured satin with white streaks. And at first glance you might think that they are cut from the same five-petalled floral pattern book as flowers like buttercups. But when you put them close together, the two species close together, you can see how different they are. In buttercup, the floral parts, the sepals and petals, are in fives, but they're separate from each other and they're broadly saucer-shaped or cup-like. In Herb Robert, however, you can see that the five sepals are joined at the base into a sort of tube, and they're covered with hairs, some of them long and prickly looking, and others short with gland-tipped tops to them. These are designed to keep off uninvited insects from access to the flower. Then if you look at the petals, in our buttercup the petals are separate and saucer-shaped, but here the lower part of each petal is claw-like and at right angles to the blade-like upper part. And those five claws are held together into a tight tube about 9 millimeters long by the sepals. And nectar is stored at the base of the sepals. When the flower first opens, the five outer stamens are arranged in an upright position in the centre of the flower, above the stigmas. The five carpels sit in a cluster around a slender pillar in the centre of the flower, surmounted by the five long stigmas, which have their receptive surfaces pressed closely together and are not yet ready to receive pollen. These outer stamens are the first to split open and release their pollen, their conspicuous yellow pollen grains forming a rosette immediately above the pink styles. The inner stamens, meanwhile, continue to nestle in the furrows at the base of the petals, curved outwards as they wait their turn. There are nectar glands at the base of the outer ring of stamens on the outside. In the second stage of the flower's development, the stigmas rise above the stamens and the five branches separate to present their receptive inner surfaces. And then finally, in the third stage, the inner stamens rise up to surround the style, and they split open or dehisce while the style lengthens so that the stigmas remain out of reach of the newly released pollen. These movements are nothing less than a ballet in silent, slow motion, especially if we can choreograph onto the stage of the flower the aerial flight of the insect dancers, bees, beetles and hoverflies, as they move between the stigmatic prima ballerina and her five slender arms and the two troops of five male stamens. There's quite a story behind the name Herb Robert. The Latin name given to the plant by Linnaeus in the 18th century was Geranium Robertianum, which more or less means Herb Robert, in honour of St. Rupert of Salzburg, whose aid was invoked in conditions such as bleeding sores, ulcers, and the awful bacterial skin condition known as erysipelas, which is characterised by inflammation of the skin, particularly on the face and on the arms. But the older name for the plant in Latin was Herba rubra, which means the red herb. And it's easy to see why. Because if you look at the plant as a whole, you can see the way in which the stems, the nodes or joints particularly, swollen and red, and the leaves very often are also red, particularly where conditions are very bright. And the use of the plant in traditional herbal medicine is a classic example of the doctrine of signatures at work. Because this redness of the stems, the swelling of the joints, was taken as a signal from God that the plant would be useful in conditions that were characterized by redness of the skin, inflammation of the skin, or swelling of the joints. The 3-act story of its pollination is only the first part of the story of Herb Robert. What follows is every bit as wonderful. But we'll have to wait for a few weeks before we can get tickets for Act 2.